Hey everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Alex Budd. I use he and him pronouns, and I'm the Alliance organizer for the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance, which is a network of 90 organizations and hundreds of individuals across the Pacific Northwest working at the intersection of forest and climate defense. This webinar today is the first in a series over the coming months, diving deep into the Northwest Forest Plan and the amendment process currently underway to update the Northwest Forest Plan for the coming decades. Covering nearly 25 million acres of public lands across California, Oregon, and Washington, the Northwest Forest Plan sets management guidelines for federally managed forest lands across the region. Currently, the Forest Service is in the process of revising and updating the Northwest Forest Plan for the first time since it was first enacted 30 years ago. Obviously, a lot has changed, both in society and in our forests and our climate since the mid-90s, and the amendments to the Northwest Forest Plan are going to be setting the course for how these forests are managed across the Pacific Northwest for decades to come. So today we'll be digging into the background and context for the Northwest Forest Plan and the amendment process. In subsequent webinars, which we'll be sharing more about later, we'll be exploring other key issues as well as some of the specific changes and updates to the plan that the Forest Service is proposing. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you all today from the traditional homelands of the Multnomah, Clackamas, and Cascade Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Cowlitz, and Molalla peoples, as well as others who have lived, traveled, and traded here since time immemorial, and whose lands have been taken from them for the ongoing benefit of settler colonialism. Just a few minutes down the road from where I'm sitting today is near Chokiku, a traditional encampment and gathering site near the confluence of the Columbia and Willamette rivers in what is now known as Northeast Portland. As Portland was developed, the original inhabitants of these lands were forcibly dispersed throughout the city and beyond, including onto the Grand Ronde, Siletz, and Warm Springs reservations, among others across the region. Just acknowledging ourselves as uninvited guests in these lands can't do justice to the complexity and brutality of the ongoing history of colonization or contribute that much to righting those wrongs. So I want to invite all of us to continually make more time to learn that history and reflect on your place within it. A couple logistics before we get started. We'll be hearing from 3 speakers today, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end. So please hang on to your questions, or you can just put them in the chat, and we'll be collecting them and then getting through as many as we can after we hear from our speakers. And then again, please remember to keep yourself muted. So just some quick bios. I'm really excited to welcome and introduce our speakers today. First up, we'll be hearing from Brenna Bell, who's the Forest Climate Manager at 350 Portland and a member of the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance Steering Committee. Brenna's been working on national forest issues since 1997. She has her own dog-eared copy of the Northwest Forest Plan and has brought several lawsuits to enforce Northwest Forest Plan implementation by the Forest Service. We'll also hear from Dominick Delasalla, Chief Scientist for Wild Heritage, who has authored more than 300 peer-reviewed scientific papers and 9 books about forests, climate change, endangered species, and speaking truth to power. And then we'll also be hearing from Chandra, LeGue, Oregon Wild Senior Conservation Advocate, working out of their Eugene office. Chandra's been focused on public lands, forest policy, and community engagement education on this topic for the past 20 years. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Brenna to get us started.
Thank you, Alex. I also want to acknowledge there are several people here in this room who could be talking about this, some of whom were there at the birth of the Northwest Forest Plan, definitely in the company of elders and mentors who had a lot to do with bringing this plan into fruition. And second disclosure is that even though I have worked on national forests for a long time, I'm currently focused more on private lands, state lands, and urban forests. So I might not have all the info that was once at my fingertips is just slightly farther. It's more at arm's reach now. So in the question and answer period of this, I want to invite people who are in the work to also answer questions and offer things or add anything I'm missing in the chat, please. But my role is to give an overview of the last 30 years of the Northwest Forest Plan in 10 minutes. So I opted to go without slides because I figured they just have a lot of words. Chandra is going to put up a couple of maps to help out later on, but mostly you just get me riffing off of what the Northwest Forest Plan is. And before I can answer that question, I want to take a step back and talk about what is a forest plan and what is its role in forest management, knowing that we have a mixed crowd, some of you who have been steeped in this, and some of you are very new to national forest management. So I wanted to give an overview of forest planning process, where it came from, and what it means. So in reaction to the massive unchecked logging on national forests that basically started with colonization and moved its way across this continent, in 1976, Congress passed the National Forest Management Act, or NFMA. And NFMA affirmed previous multiple use mandates that came about in the 1950s, meaning that the Forest Service must manage units of the National Forest System for water, wildlife, recreation, and timber, and grazing and mining also, a little bit less. So NFMA requires the Forest Service to prepare land and resource management plans, or forest plans for short, for every single unit in the National Forest System. These plans guide all natural resource management activities, and they establish management standards and guidelines for all national forests. In the urban context, you could think of this a little bit like a zoning map, where every single piece of land has a specific overlay specifying what its primary use is. So on forest plans, those are called land allocations. And you'll have things like wilderness or timber emphasis or special species habitat, recreation, scenic area. These are all overlaying the forest plan. And every single one of these land allocations has management area directions, desired future conditions, and standards and guidelines. So the first important thing is, what is the land designated as? And the second is, how do you manage to get the desired future condition for that designation? And forest plans also create monitoring and evaluation requirements for the forest over time. So they're basically the roadmap for managing each individual national forest. And each one is different depending on, both the ecology of that place, but also the people who were doing the planning process at the time when it was created, what the underlying planning regulations were. So there's not consistency across all national forests, not even consistency just in this region, but you have this patchwork of forest plans all having to comply with the main purpose of NFMA, which is to just know what you're doing when you manage the forest and manage for multiple uses. So NFMA requires that forest plans are revised from time to time when the Secretary of Agriculture finds conditions in the unit have significantly changed, but at least every 15 years. That part hasn't really happened so much. More often than not in this area, most of our existing forest plans were done in the late 80s and early 90s. So they were the forest plans that were in existence by the time we got to the National Forest, or the Northwest Forest Plan. Mostly these plans have been changed through a series of amendments. And the biggest of those amendments is the Northwest Forest Plan, which in 1994 amended the plans for 19 national forests and 7 Bureau of Land Management districts, total covering 24 million acres of federal land in Western Oregon, Washington, and Northwest California. And just a little bump out for any of you who are on this Zoom and not from Oregon, you might be surprised to hear that the Bureau of Land Management manages federal forests. It's a particular sliver of history that the BLM has a lot of forests, especially concentrated in southwestern Oregon. And for the very first time, with the Northwest Forest Plan, the National Forest and the BLM were combined in an ecosystemic management plan. So I want to retract now. So that's what land forest management plans are. A little bit of history so you understand the context in which the Northwest Forest Plan came. And thanks for putting up the maps, Chandra. So again, many of you know the history of how the Northwest Forest Plan came to be, but in very short, As I mentioned, rampant logging, fueled by colonization and capitalism, led to just a massive disruption to forested ecosystems in the Northwest. And this, in turn, led to a collapse of biodiversity. And that was epitomized by the population decline of the northern spotted owl, which is a habitat specialist. It needs late successional habitat to thrive. And as the forest became fragmented, as there was more edges, there were more species that have, they're just well adapted to being in edge space and less late successional space. The spotted owl and its prey were both in decline. So in the late 1980s, activists and scientists petitioned Fish and Wildlife Service to list the owl as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And in 1990, in response to court order, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did list the northern spotted owl as threatened. That's kind of when all hell broke loose in Northwest forests, because logging continued, right? The agencies were deeply entrenched with the timber industry, and they did not want to change practices. And so again, environmental advocates went to court and said, hey, the owl is listed as threatened. It is clear that if you keep logging to the way that you've been logging, they might go extinct. And one of my judicial heroes, Western Washington District Court Judge William Dwyer in 1991, halted Forest Service timber sales in spotted owl habitat across the entire Northwest. It was a region-wide injunction on logging. So cool, so courageous. And that shut down the timber industry in the Northwest. And you can imagine, I mean, we talk about the power that they have now still in politics, but imagine in 1990. They were the most powerful political industry in the region, and they were pissed. And so this has been recounted in the Timber Wars. There's a great podcast that OPB put out a couple of years back that tells this whole story. But kind of the culmination was the Timber Summit in 1993, when President Clinton and Vice President Gore came to Portland, brought a bunch of people together, scientists, advocates, people from the industry, to try and figure out a solution to break this moratorium on logging. And that is the roots of the Northwest Forest Plan. So 1994, the Northwest Forest Plan was approved. That's a very short history, but it had three main objectives. And one was to protect and enhance habitat for mature and old-growth forests and related species. Two, to restore and maintain the ecological integrity of watersheds and aquatic ecosystems. And three, produce a predictable level of timber sales, special forest products, livestock grazing, minerals, and recreational opportunities, as well as maintaining stability of rural communities and economies. So it was pretty broad reaching. A lot of people think of it just as something that was for old growth forests, but a super important part of it was the aquatic component. For the first time, it took an ecosystemic approach to forest management across the entire region. And like I said, it amended 19 national forest plans and 7 BLM district resource management plans. And so what this amendment did was create additional land allocations and standards and guidelines to meet those. When I'm done talking, I'll put in the chat links that will take you to the actual Northwest Forest Plan record of decision and standards and guidelines. As Alec mentioned, I have my own hard copy of it. I think it's always great to go back to the base documents. And even though, as I'll say in a moment, things have changed since '94, it's still really amazing to read this at that time, a very visionary approach to forest management that talked about interconnected ecosystems and a way to shift away from extraction to ecosystems as a main management value. So I'll just go over a few of the main components of the National Forest Plan, the Northwest Forest Plan. with an invitation for you to read it yourself. It's not long, and it's actually fairly clear. So, main components, though. That first, protection of late successional habitat and species. So the first main thing they did was create a new land designation called a late successional reserve. And about 30% of the area covered by the Northwest Forest Plan is in late succession reserves. The management objective in LSRs is to protect and enhance conditions of late successional and old growth forest ecosystems as habitat for related species, including the northern spotted owl. And as written in the original plan, limited stand management is permitted, but it was subject to review by the Regional Ecosystem Office. So there could be management on behalf of late successional habitat, but it had to go through the REO, which was an interdisciplinary group that was located in the Region 6 headquarters. Another thing that the Northwest Forest Plan did, which was so cool, is it created the Survey and Manage program. And this really relied heavily on the precautionary principle of science. Like, we don't really know what we're doing, so let's move slowly and see. When it was approved, and this is a direct quote from the plan itself, they say it was unknown whether reserve network and other standards and guidelines would offer a reasonable assurance of the persistence for many rare and little-known species thought to be associated with late successional old-growth forests. And these include things like mosses, liverworts, lichens, fungi, vascular plants, a lot of cool slugs, snails, salamanders, and one mammal, the red tree vole. And so they created a set of management standards and guidelines and added those to the plan, which required surveys before management actions for this huge list of species. And then if they were found, it limited what actions could be taken in that area. And so to be included on the survey and manage list, there were 3 basic criteria. The species must occur within the plan area, must be closely associated with late successional or old-growth forest, and the reserve system or other standards and guidelines of the Northwest Forest Plan on first glance at the beginning do not appear to provide for a reasonable assurance of species persistence. And so there were, I should have gotten the original number, I'm sorry, but well over 100 species that were part of this. And there was this massive uptick in survey jobs with the agencies, as before every project they did, they had to survey for these rare species. So that was the first main goal, is to protect late successional habitat for species and biodiversity. Then that second big goal is around aquatics. And this was a cool thing to come out of the Northwest Forest Plan, which, had been in response to the owl, but clearly the salmon are also having a hard time, and the aquatic ecosystems in these forests had been seriously impacted by logging. So this is where we get the aquatic conservation strategy, which has 3 main components: riparian reserves, which are areas along streams, wetlands, ponds, lakes, and unstable terrestrial areas where riparian-dependent resources will receive primary emphasis. And that's about 11% of the overall land in the Northwest Forest Plan area. Most of these reserves are like long, thin reserves that follow creeks and streams, but some are around ponds, lakes, wetlands, and like I said, some unstable slopes. There's also a system of key watersheds where all watersheds within the forest planning area are designated either as Tier 1, Tier 2, or a non-key watershed, depending on how important they were to the protection of sensitive and threatened species. And then there's the watershed analysis. This was also a really cool component of the original plan, where every single major watershed received an in-depth interdisciplinary analysis that looked at the history of the watershed, took baseline measurements and talked about baseline conditions when it was done, and then projected into the future for future desired conditions. So again, it was the first time that kind of this fine-tooth ecological comb had gone over all of these. And so every major watershed covered by the plan got a watershed analysis, and that was used to direct future action. So, and then, so those are the main land designations and new programs that were created by the Northwest Forest Plan. And it also has a set of standards and guidelines that cover a range of activities. That includes like what can and can't happen in the new land designations, and most of which were more ecologically oriented than those in the underlying forest plans. If there was something in the underlying forest plan, like the original forest plan, like say for Mount Hood National Forest, that was more protective than the Northwest Forest Plan, that stood. Whatever was more protective is what moved forward into the future. So in a way, the Northwest Forest Plan provided like the minimum protections for the forest plan. And I will say, of course, I'm emphasizing the cool things it did. It still designated a lot of land for logging, what they call the matrix, and 16% of land covered by the Northwest Forest Plan is in matrix, which is specifically designated for industrial resource production. It still has some standards and guidelines that were better than some of the underlying forest plans, but it certainly did not stop that from happening. And contrary to some of the myths around the Northwest Forest Plan, matrix absolutely included late successional and old growth trees. Like what the Northwest Forest Plan did not do was protect mature and old growth trees from being logged. And as we'll see, I'm about to wrap up. I guess I couldn't do this in 10 minutes. Sorry. Okay, I just want to very, very briefly say, where are we now? Right, we're 30 years in. Where are we now? Everything's been weakened. Everything that I just talked about is not as strong as it was in 1994. The industry and the agencies have pushed back hard against a lot of these since the beginning. So with late successional reserves, I'll just call it death by 1,000 cuts. I won't talk about all the lawsuits that have litigated this. What I will say is the Forest Service has really gotten good on its rhetoric about active management being important to restore late successional habitat. And we're talking road building and logging, sometimes of mature or old growth trees. And the Regional Ecosystem Office, that like extra layer of protection is mostly just a rubber stamp. So LSRs are still important, but they certainly do not provide the protection that I believe that the original authors of the forest plan wanted. And in terms of survey and manage, it's also been rolled back. In 2001, the agency decreased the number of species covered by survey and manage protections. And they also have limited the places in which those surveys have to happen to stands that are over 80 years old. Even old growth pockets within younger stands are not protected. And then a kind of a suite of other activities no longer have to have those surveys. Also, with the protection of aquatic habitat and species, it's also just been kind of an attrition where the Forest Service's language around what is needed for ecological restoration has involved more and more active management in these reserves. Also, those wonderful watershed assessments, they were so great, and now they are so outdated because they have not been updated since the mid-90s. I think the original thought was they would be updated as we move forward with the plan, but we're 30 years in, and most watersheds only receive that once. Also, a huge shift is that the BLM, which was pulled into the Northwest Forest Plan in 1994, kicking and screaming, finally got itself out in 2016 and is now covered with its own resource management plan that is much, much less protected. I really need to wrap up, so I'll just say that overall, the Northwest Forest Plan was a huge step forward in whole ecosystem management, but has been beaten back by politics and industry. And as we know, it also didn't include climate change, fire, or tribal co-management, which are all reasons that this upcoming amendment is so important. And thank you all for your interest in it. And I think we have a rare opportunity to make a big change in national forest management with the amendment. And so hopefully I've inspired you a little bit to stick with the trouble, because it's going to be some hard work. And now I want to pass it over to you, Chandra.
I'm going to jump in. I think we're actually going to go to Dominick first.
Sorry.
No
To
worries.
Dominick.
Thank you, Brenna. That was an admirable job at trying to fit so much into 15 minutes that it really doesn't fit. But thank you. That was so thorough. And a really helpful grounding in what the Northwest Forest Plan is and how we got here. So now we're going to turn to Dr. Dominick Delasalla to dig in more specifically about the climate impacts and stakes of Northwest Forest Plan and the amendment. Dominick, I guess just to get us started, I'm curious, how has Northwest Forest Plan affected carbon emissions and storage on federally managed forest lands in the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, hi, everybody. Sorry I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm on my way out the door for international travel, so really pressed for time, but really happy to be part of this discussion. And I too go back to the early days of the Northwest Forest Plan, just because I'm an old guy now. And so is the plan, but we both are working pretty well. So because I don't have a presentation, I thought we would just have kind of a Q&A between Alex and I, and kind of a conversation of the 3 or 4 questions that we have outlined. And I'm going to be as succinct as I can so that Chandra has time for her piece as well. So the first question was, how does it relate to the forest carbon issues in the region? And so the Northwest Forest Plan, when it was envisioned way back in the early 1990s, really was not focused on carbon. It was an ecosystem management and a biodiversity plan, first and foremost, that was built on the concepts of conservation biology, and it arose from the field of conservation biology that many of us were just starting to get involved in, that started in the late 80s, early 90s, and became part of the underlining foundation of the Northwest Forest Plan, which was aimed at originally the spotted owl, but over 1,000 species associated with the owl, the murrelet, and salmon. So it was very comprehensive, but there were blind spots. And some of the blind spots include they weren't really aware of the barred owl invasion at the time and how that would be a depressing factor on spotted owls, which they were trying to recover. And there wasn't really an emphasis on carbon. Carbon has only emerged in the last decade or so, and it's focused a lot on our region because we have some of the most carbon-dense forests in the world, particularly the coastal rainforests that extend from the coast redwoods all the way up to southeast Alaska and the Tongass are more carbon dense than any forest on the planet, mostly, except with a couple of exceptions. And so what happened is when there was a big reduction in the amount of logging on federal lands, the added benefit of the Northwest Forest Plan was it switched the region from a source of emissions to a sink for carbon. And that sink has been pretty extensive. It's not maximized yet because we still don't have all the mature and old growth forests back, but it definitely has gone in the right direction and continues to go in that direction, even with wildfire as a mitigating factor in whether forests are storing carbon long term. Now, we do know that if you concentrate on a system of carbon reserves, that would be an add-on to the Northwest Forest Plan, you will capture a bunch of other really important values. We did a series of papers in the, I guess it was 2015, where we constructed the carbon reserve network, where we looked at carbon as the umbrella strategy for the Northwest, all the way up to Alaska. And we overlaid species richness, and several ecosystem services, richness for several taxa. And we found that carbon was a good umbrella strategy because if you get the carbon, you get high species richness across taxa, you get clean water, you get recreation, and you get all these other values that come with carbon as an umbrella strategy. So while it has been an unintended consequence of the Northwest Forest Plan, it remains as a build-on strategy that we should be adding to by addition and not subtraction as the Northwest Forest Plan goes forward, because now we've got carbon and climate change as huge factors. I'll end there, Alex.
Thank you. Follow up to that, how is climate change affecting the forest in our region, and how might that need to inform the revisions to the Northwest Forest Plan?
Yeah, so this is the most depressing part of my job because I focus on the global level and spend a lot of my time working with scientists that are part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change doing downscale climate models. And we've published our own version of the downscale climate models for the Northwest Forest Plan. And, you know, it's like a lot of other places, it's going to get hot. It's going to get a lot hotter. And, you know, we're dangerously crossing the 1.5 degrees centigrade safety net for the atmosphere. And the further removed from that we get, the more extreme the conditions are going to be. I mean, we've already seen heat domes that affected Portland, for instance, in 2020. And those heat domes combined with what's called the vapor pressure deficit, which is the measure of how much moisture is in the atmosphere, how much you can wring out of the atmosphere. Both of those have been going in really bad territory. I mean, we're seeing more heat domes, which is what really was behind the 2020 Labor Day fires that took out half of my town in Talent, Oregon, for instance, and a number of other places. And vapor pressure deficit, which is correlated with the drought index. So those two factors, an early onset of the wildfire season, reduced snowpack, reduced stream flows, peak flows are going to be down. We're going to get more rain on snow. It may not mean less precipitation, but it could mean, annual precipitation, but it could mean more droughts. So all of this means that it feeds back on fire and insects and diseases, and the forests are stressed. I see it in the hills where I live down here in the Klamath-Siskiyou. There's a lot of tree death that I didn't see 10, 15 years ago because the trees are really stressed from drought, and the heat dome in 2020 really caused a reverberating effect. And so when the agencies try to work on this by thinning, it's going to fail. It is not going to work because they can never get to scale, and because the overriding factor is the top-down driver of climate change. The only way to resolve this is to protect natural forest ecosystems as a natural climate solution. So that's mature and old growth, riparian areas, complex early xeral forest that had a severe fire, also have most of their carbon still retained in the soils and the big trees. So we need to have a natural climate solutions working in tandem with the reduction of emissions across all sectors and strategically targeting fire risk reduction at communities and reforming forestry practices so that we're not clear cutting forest and setting up these dangerous tinder boxes. In fact, a study that came out of Oregon State University a couple of years ago showed that most fires that were spilling over from the wildlands were coming from private lands, not public lands. And yet all the emphasis is on public lands. And by scaling up the forest thinning and the logging, they're going to be putting more emissions into the atmosphere, contributing long-term to the fire problem, and doing nothing to help communities. So yeah, I'll stop there because that was a lot.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. I'm curious also what's at stake in the plan this time around, that might get blamed on climate change or insects or wildfires. Kind of just asking you to expand on what you were just talking about there.
Yeah, because I could go back to the days when the Dwyer decision put all the scientists in the limelight, the architects of the Northwest Forest Plan. It was based on the viability determination in the National Forest Management Act that really gave us the Northwest Forest Plan. And my big concern is we don't have that at this point going forward. I mean, that FACA team does not include owl Merlet scientists, salmonid scientists. It's a stakeholder-driven process. It's not being driven by the scientists that should be at the table, the carbon scientists, the reserve design scientists, the conservation biologists, they're missing from this iteration. And the problem is, I think the Forest Service is going to put all its eggs in one basket on fire, and it's going to use that as an excuse to go into the mature, especially in the dry forest, where we have already seen efforts to reduce or remove the east side scientific screens that were in place for 2 decades as well, to protect the large trees. I think they're going to really try to push the diameter and the age limits on tree removals in the dry forest. We may not even have reserves in the dry forest within the Northwest Forest Plan, because the agency's science synthesis that was done prior to the plan revision called for the removal of reserves. We may see changes to the riparian buffers. We may see changes to the mature forest in the wet forest, pushing up the age limit on removals beyond 80, which is the current situation, maybe to 100. That all bothers me, because that's going to put more carbon in the atmosphere. It's going to reduce the sink. It's going to create a source of emissions. It's going to do nothing for fire, and it's going to degrade spotted owl habitat because of the notion that owls are impacted by fire, when in fact we published a paper last year. Monica Bond was the lead. We looked at 100 and I think it was 110 spotted owl territories in the range of the northern spotted owl. Something like 88% of them had multiple timber entries before and after the fires. And yet, guess what gets blamed on spotted owl nest abandonment? And not only did they have timber removal, but they also had barred owl encroachment. So the two kind of go hand in hand. When you log the forest, you open it up to barred owl invasions, and you create this vicious feedback that's not good for the forest, the owl, or fire mitigation.
Thanks, Dominic. I know there's obviously, with each of these topics, we could spend a whole hour with each of you, and still have more to learn and talk about. But as we're coming up on the end of our time, I want to turn now to Chandra, who's going to give us a rundown of why the Northwest Forest Plan is being amended, what that process looks like, and what we know about what the Forest Service is proposing for changes to the Northwest Forest Plan.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. So yeah, I'm going to give a bit of a rundown of the proposed amendment more logistically. And for context, I'm going to start by just reiterating, because Brenna and Dominic have both talked about some of these changes since the plan was put in place 30 years ago. And I do have some summary slides to share with y'all. So yeah, the Forest Service, in announcing an amendment, and I'll get to that in a moment, listed some of these changes that have taken place over the last 30 years. And as Brenna talked about, and Dominic too, we have seen a lot of changes that are positive, improvements in watershed health, a reduction in some habitat loss as intended by the Northwest Forest Plan. But the effects of climate change, increased competition of barred owls with threatened spotted owls, and increased logging on BLM and private lands mean that a lot of the ecosystem goals haven't been met. And so when the Forest Service laid out their proposed amendment, they talked about wanting to achieve the initial, the original goals of the Northwest Forest Plan better by amending it in some way. So they list some other things, including newer monitoring reports, assessments, a science synthesis that was done back in 2015-ish, requirements under the Endangered Species Act for protecting critical habitat of spotted owls. So new information about the components that the plan was put in place for. We talked about how the BLM, their forests are not a part of the Northwest Forest Plan anymore. Dominic talked about how we know a lot more about climate and carbon, and the importance for our forests, and President Biden's 2 executive orders over the last 3 years, calling out the importance of protecting forests as a climate solution, recognizes that new information that was not included in the original plan. there's still logging going on and degrading habitat for threatened species. And as Dominic talked about, there's increases in wildfire and other impacts of climate change due to human caused climate change. One of the things that was completely left out of the development of the 1994 plan was tribal involvement and consideration of indigenous cultural uses and practices on public land. So there's a lot of change that has happened, and many of these things were how the Forest Service identified the need for an amendment to the plan. So a lot of these changes were already evident a decade ago. I mean, it's 30 years old. So in 2015, the Forest Service did consider revising the Northwest Forest Plan. They started the process, and revising meaning like a pretty big overhaul. That's not what they're proposing now. So back in 2015, they started holding listening sessions and completed an assessment and science synthesis to inform the revision. But then that whole effort was put on pause during the Trump administration, which I think is a very good thing. Last year, though, the Forest Service announced this amendment process for the Northwest Forest Plan. So an amendment is meant to be a smaller change than a full-on revision. And Brenna talked about how there have been lots of small amendments over time for various forest plans. And but again, this is for 17 different national forests in the region. And so even amendments can have big changes. So along with this process starting, the Forest Service convened a federal advisory committee to help inform the process and decision. And that's an official capacity committee that people have to be appointed by Congress, I think, to sit on. And it's made up of diverse interests. Some of you I know have been more intimately involved in that. But there's been several multi-day meetings over the last year, as well as subgroup meetings by that committee. And Dominic, you were just saying that, it's pretty focused on people with expertise in fire and managing dry forests, for example, and not necessarily a full component of, wildlife biologists and ecologists. So I can post later the website where you can see the makeup of that committee, but it's informing the Forest Service in this process. So then in December, the Forest Service released the official notice for moving forward with the amendment. And I will try to put this in the official notice. Let's see, chat. I know I'm trying to multitask. Here's the official notice if anybody wants to go and read it. But it started a scoping process. And so by nature, scoping is usually the first public process step required under various laws, the 2012 Planning Rule and the National Environmental Policy Act, to gather public input and be transparent in the process. So there was a public comment period that kicked off back then in December. There's not a lot of specificity often, and including in this case, in the scoping periods. And so I'll get to in a minute what the proposal actually said. So the arrow on this little timeline that the Forest Service created is kind of where the scoping process happened. There had already been meetings and input from the Federal Advisory Committee and public workshops. They developed a proposed amendment, and then there was scoping. And many Alliance members submitted official scoping comments, encouraged their members and networks to do the same. We put together a toolkit for understanding this proposal and submitting comments, and the wildfire working group of this alliance became temporarily the Northwest Forest Plan working group and developed a sign-on comment letter that many alliance groups sign on to. So we've been involved since this started the public process at the end of last year. So in the end, the Forest Service received over 9,200 comments from the public during the scoping period. And then there also were other ways that the public could weigh in during the Federal Advisory Committee meetings. And I know many Alliance members showed up, attended, and gave testimony in that way as well. So it's a little bit outside of this standardized process, but still really valuable. So what are they actually proposing? Like I said, it was kind of vague in the notice that went out. And I'm not going to go into any of these in detail. I'm just putting them up here. But the Forest Service definitely started this whole process by saying that they were focusing on 5 main things: addressing wildfire risk, climate change, old growth forests, tribal engagement, and rural communities and workforce. And so you see those initial focus areas reflected in this the amendment that they put forward. These are the things that they said that they wanted to see changes in. And, you know, again, they're quite vague, and you can read positives or negatives into any number of them. And an environmental analysis will come out that will have a lot more specificity, and that'll probably be the topic of another webcast. So yeah, just want to note that not all of these statements are red flags, but there are a lot of concerns that came up from the conservation community. And just to go over those real briefly, you know, we could see, and Dominick just named a bunch of the potential issues that, you know, could be, or rollbacks that could happen. Though, because they are trying to focus, I don't know that they're going to be changing the borders of the reserves or reducing stream buffers. That would really need to come from a revision and not an amendment, but who knows? So we're worried that the amendment could continue to allow logging in mature forests. It's one of the downsides of the Northwest Forest Plan, as Brenna and Dominick said. This picture was taken in the grasshopper timber sale up on Mount Hood. It's not in a reserve area, and they could cut down trees like this. And we're seeing that they could be using, you know, risk of wildfire as an excuse to log in these areas. So that's we really are concerned about that. There's also a lot of ecological differences between moist forest and dry forest, different forest types, and those forest needs that could be glossed over in order to address wildfire fears. There's concern that logging can be seen as the primary way of managing forests moving forward. Well, continuing, I guess, but overlooking the use of fire and non-commercial means to restore resilient ecosystems in the wake of climate change. And then there's a concern that really incorporating Indigenous cultural use and practices may not happen in this process due to ingrained agency thinking and policies and the really fast timeline that this amendment is happening under. If you really want to engage and involve tribes and perspectives, you might want to slow down and think about it doing things in a different way, but that's not what's happening. So I want to just real quick, the intersecting forest plan amendment could actually have a big impact on one of the main concerns, which is continuing to allow mature and old growth logging under the Northwest Forest Plan. So at the same time in December that the Northwest Forest Plan proposed amendment came out, there's a national old growth amendment that was announced by the Biden administration. And it would actually end commercial logging of old growth on all national forests by amending every national forest plan that Brenna told us, you know, is required in every national forest, which has never been done and is a huge step, though it has a lot of loopholes and doesn't adequately protect mature forests. But that amendment is moving forward and at a faster pace than the Northwest Forest Plan amendment. And the key important thing here is that national effort, if it has strong protections for old growth or potentially mature forests, it would supersede the changes in the Northwest Forest Plan. It's like layers of amendments, right? And what supersedes each one. And so weighing in the comment period that's coming up later this summer for this plan amendment could really help inform and add an extra layer of protection for old trees in the Northwest Forest Plan. Just to confuse things. So next steps on the Northwest Forest Plan amendment. Here's their nifty timeline again. We've moved a step forward after the comment period, the scoping comment period closed. There has been more meetings by the Federal Advisory Committee to kind of hone in on what the analysis should look like moving forward and what should the specifics that should be in the draft environmental impact statement that the public then has another chance to weigh in on. And so they're developing that now. And again, we will get a lot more specifics this summer. We don't know exactly when yet, because there's a lot of things that they're considering. And from what I hear, and I know there's people out there who have really been listening into the advisory committee meetings and probably have a better idea of this, but I think they're really struggling with finding complete agreement on a lot of things that can move forward. Totally surprising, right? And so it's been holding things up a little bit. But it's going to be really important that people who care about our Pacific Northwest forests, our climate, water, wildlife, and tribal sovereignty weigh in during this time when the draft environmental impact statement comes out this summer. So that's where we are.
Thank you, Chandra. That was really helpful. Okay, well, we're almost at 1. We have a few minutes for questions. I've seen a reminder, please drop your questions in the chat if you have one. One that I saw, where did it go? Ooh. Yeah, well, if you have questions, drop them in the chat. Someone did ask more specifically, oh, there's a good one. How do we put power into the commenting? Strongly allied and coherent message. Just any reflections from you three on how to make comments and participation in the public process more powerful and effective?
I mean, it's I think we'll probably do something similar with through the alliance of coming up with a toolkit that aligns with the alliance's general positions on climate and forests. However, we recognize that not all groups and individuals involved with the Forest Climate Alliance agree on the nitty-gritty, and so they will be suggestions, and people should, but we'll try to make it easy for people to weigh in using some talking points and common values. But again, can get into a lot of nuance and recognize that not everyone might agree on every point.
Thanks. Someone also asked why the BLM. How did they get themselves exempted from the Northwest Forest Plan? Who let that happen? Any of y'all want to give like a quick answer to that?
I mean, the BLM was never happy with being included in the Northwest Forest Plan. It resisted from the beginning and fought back the whole time. There's this odd law called the Oregon-California Lands Act, 1937, that the BLM and the courts have both misinterpreted to make it seem like the BLM lands are timber dominant lands when it's actually a multiple use statute. But they just fought, and they just, as an agency, were like, we're not going to be part of this anymore. And I mean, it's more complicated, but it was the agency who opted out, and people fought them, and the court sided with them, and now they have their own resource plan. That's the very short version of the story.
Thanks, Brenna. Steve, did you have a quick question here?
Sure. Thank you all very much. Steve Homer with the American Bird Conservancy. I've been following the FAC process and have a lot of concerns about where the Forest Service seems to be going right now. And so there is a feeling like we need to have a stronger political response towards the administration. So we are working on a sign-on letter. Dominick helped out draft this. I put it into the chat. But this is going to be followed up with some meetings with the administration, basically to try to encourage them to do a strong alternative that would look at endangered species and climate. Right now, it appears that those issues are being excluded from the discussion, and in my opinion, it's leading to wrong answers, just because the Forest Service seems to be trying to control the process to such a degree. I don't really feel like the FAC process has actually been going very well. Because of the Forest Service manipulation of the group, but also there's been a tremendous degree of tribal disrespect on display. At the third meeting, the tribes had 133 out of 146 of their recommendations vetoed by a timber industry representative with no explanation. And in the same meeting, the Forest Service basically seemed to lose control of the agenda, and the tribal section was left all of 15 minutes at the end of the meeting to handle these disagreements. Needless to say, the tribes felt very, very upset about this. They basically blasted the Forest Service to close out the third meeting, which was supposed to be the final meeting. but none of the groups got done. They got to no agreements with any of the committees. So there's now going to be a fourth meeting in June. But again, I don't really have a lot of confidence at this point that the FAC recommendations are going to be worth very much, and that the Northwest Forest Plan really needs presidential leadership, and that we need to engage the administration and try to push this into a different direction.
Thanks, Steve. And yeah, just to reiterate, we'll be sending out, thank you for signing up today. We'll be sending out information about the following webinars, and as the DEIS process kicks off this summer, can share more information and resources about how to participate and comment and speak out. Dominic, did you have a quick final thought on that before we wrap up?
Yeah, I got maybe my closing comment on this is that the Forest Service can't do this by itself. It really needs direction from the White House, and this is not just the Northwest Forest Plan. It's all 128 Forest Plan revisions that are coming out as a result of this EIS next month. And my big worry in all of this is that nuance is not going to do it. If we can't come together as a strong, unified community and say, we've got to protect mature and old growth forest. Here's our line in the sand. These are not problems from a fire standpoint. We got bigger problems in the logged areas that need attention. I think the reason why we don't have a strong plan is because we don't have a strong community. And I think we really need to think about what the nuancing is doing to set us up for failure.
Okay, thank you, Dominic, for those closing thoughts. We're right here at 1 o'clock, and I want to respect everyone's time. Again, we'll be sending out the recording of this webinar and also the slides and links and things from all of our speakers. Just want to thank again Brenna, Dominic, and Chandra for sharing your time and insights and brilliance with us today. And thank you everyone else for showing up today and being part of the discussion. If you have questions that we didn't get to talk to, or a question that only occurs to you at 2 a.m. tonight, you can send me an email, send them to me, and we'll do our best to follow up with them after the fact. As mentioned, this webinar is hosted by...
Are you doing a plug for the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance, Alex? Because this would be a great time.
Yes.
Before you leave.
Yeah, before you all leave, this webinar is hosted by members of the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance, which is a region-wide network of a bunch of different organizations and groups working together. We'll be doing a lot more work around the Northwest Forest Plan and all kinds of other issues affecting forests and climate in our region. And you can get involved and learn more at our website, which I just put in the chat.
You can also donate.
And you can also donate. Yeah, thank you, Brenna. And finally, this is the first in a series of webinars, so we'll be having others coming up. We should be announcing the second one soon. That one is going to dig more specifically into some of the things that have come up today, including Indigenous inclusion, fire resilience, and maternal growth forest protection. So stay tuned for that, and look forward to seeing you next time. And thanks again.
Oh, and there's a really cool rally coming up on June 13th. Thanks, Kai, for putting that in the chat before you leave. To protect mature and old growth from getting logged during this rulemaking, please come out to the Forest Service headquarters from 3 to 5, right in front of the headquarters at Terry Short Plaza in Portland on June 13th. And we'll get to see each other in person, and we can continue this conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Have a good rest of your day.